Hi, and welcome to the Risk and Resilience Insight Interviews. I'm Grant Kennedy, Managing Director at KRisk, and today we have Fiona Davidge with us. And Fiona, welcome. Thank you for joining us. You're going to give us some great insight into ISO31000 and your background and interest and involvement in the work in that. So it's going to be interesting. But before we get to the topic, maybe if you could just give us a little bit of a background of the roles that you've done and anything like that.
Hello, greetings to everyone. Yes, I'm now head of corporate risk at the House of Commons. I've only been there for a few months. Before that, for 10 years, I was senior enterprise risk manager at the Wellcome Trust, which is a global biomedical funding charity, the sort of second largest funding charity in the world after the Gates Foundation, where I covered a sort of portfolio of things, not just corporate risk, but the insurance program, business continuity, and for several years I line managed the health and safety team. So many of the sort of spread of roles that people view risk in the broadest sense. Before that, I was 5 years as a corporate risk manager at London Underground, more just focusing on corporate risk there. And before that, I did 9 years at Thames Water, which is where I entered the risk world. I joined Thames in my first sort of business role, which was more emergency planning and then business continuity. And then when I've been there about 4 or 5 years, risk was still very much in its infancy. And somebody in the business said, hey, we need to do this stuff called corporate risk. Well, that team over there does risky stuff, you know, emergency planning, business continuity. And I was dispatched by my manager to learn what the heck this stuff was. And I did the diploma of risk management for the IRM at the time. And we set about the very start of the corporate risk process that Thames Water had. I'm sure many years later has gone in much better directions and further than we started it off. So a varied career, working largely for organisations that really sort of sit at the heart of society and what we are and what we do. And I sometimes laugh that I know far too much about pipes under London, some of which had trains in them and some of which had water and wastewater in them. And you hope the three don't ever meet. So yeah, and now I'm in a very different environment where it's all about politics and talking.
Yeah, well, vast amount of experience, and obviously we've worked together recently with we doing some work for you with training with the House of Commons, which would be good and very interesting and insightful. So some of the things you mentioned there, obviously lots of crossovers with infrastructure and the House of Commons as well, and various types of things. But that's not what we're here to talk about today. But yeah, that gives a great context and great understanding of where you've been and what you've done. But maybe to get a little bit more about insight into you, is maybe if you could tell us the riskiest thing you've ever done and what makes you resilient.
Probably the most dramatic thing. I'm not sure it's risk, it was dramatic. I actually left grammar school at 18 with 4 A levels, but I'd set my heart on becoming a registered nurse. And that's what I duly set out and did. I qualified as a nurse and I went into nursing. And it was actually in my early 30s with 2 young children. I was living in Belgium. My husband was a Royal Air Force officer, because actually one semi-dramatic thing I did in my nursing career was I left the NHS and joined the Royal Air Force as a nursing officer. But the biggest thing I did was actually I sat down in the time we were living in Belgium and thought, what do I want to do when I go back? And I realised it was no longer nursing. It wasn't intellectually challenging enough. So I decided to do a law degree. And I came back ahead of my husband with 2 young children from Belgium to the UK and embarked on a full-time law degree. And I do remember lying in bed on the first week of my lectures saying, what the heck are you doing, Fiona? Sort of, wow, you're about to embark on what's going to be fairly tough studies for 3 years. You are already a very well qualified nurse, and there was quite a sort of, but obviously I'm here where I am now. I carried on and I don't regret it at all. Actually, I don't regret that I did my nursing in the earlier years, but it was quite a leap of change. And a lot of my nursing colleagues to this day say to me, we don't understand what you do, Fiona. What the heck is it? You know, so yes.
Yeah, well, yeah, you like a challenge, but yeah, what is risk management? And sometimes when you're at a party or saying you're a risk manager, it can either really switch somebody on, or more often than not switches them off.
Oh,
Okay, let's move on to something else. So anyway, hopefully we can explain a little bit more about what risk management is, because ISO 31000 that we're going to focus on is, I suppose, that arguably the leading standard worldwide for risk management. It's what a lot of the the courses, particularly the IRM, are focused on. It's the building blocks, it's the fundamentals. A lot of the organisations that we've crossed over working with, I guess a similar sort of career path to you as well, working with large infrastructure companies. It's what they turn to try and build their structures, the frameworks, and all that sort of thing. But there may be people listening that have a bit of an awareness about ISO 31000. They may well know the content of it, but they might not know the background. They might not know how it's come together, and you're very closely involved in that. So maybe if you could just explain your involvement in a bit more detail, and what's the background to these standards? How do they come together?
Okay. I've worked in standards development for many years. It started actually when I was at Thames. I was asked to join the British Standards Committee to do with business continuity risk management, and basically Standard Committee, British Standards, which is one of the largest standards authorities in the world, has various committees. And this is largely mirrored in the international standards work as well, focusing on a topic area. And I worked on business continuity till I left Thames Water, and then of course I went into the risk job at London Underground, and I said to British Standards, well, I better come off the business continuity committee. I'm not going to be doing that anymore. And they said, oh no, Fiona, you're not escaping that easily. There's this risk standards committee over here, if you do a bit of work in standards committees, if you're actually one of the people that does some of the drafting work, they will never let you go. So, and so I joined the risk committee for British standards, and I'd been there 2 or 3 years. A group of professionals get together. You're not paid. You do it for the love of the profession, and you work collectively on documents which can be issued to business people in general. You go and buy a standard. But I've been there for 2 or 3 years when they said the main international risk management standard was due for its review schedule. They tend to be reviewed every 5 years. And they needed a couple of volunteers, with inverted commas, from the British Standards Committee, because, as I said, BSI is a big mover and shaker in the standards world, to help do the review for ISO. So myself and another lady, Julia Graham, who's now CEO of the Association of Insurance and Risk Managers, we were nominated and put forward to represent the UK. So we spent the next 2 or 3 years, twice a year, going to different parts of the world, which sounds rather more exotic than it was, because you turn up to either a hotel or a committee room somewhere, and you spend a whole week trying to work your way through rewriting the standard, which I can tell you, when you're dealing with 20, 30 people, it is in English, but often, of course, it's their third or fourth language, and you're trying to write a document by consensus. So it's a bit like, writing War and Peace with multiple authors. So that's the process. You get it to a certain draft level, and then it gets sent out to the various national committees around the world, because most countries have a standards body, who then will and they'll be asked for feedback. So that takes about 3 or 4 months, and then the next time you meet as an international standards committee, you have the even more time-consuming task, because you have to go through every single comment that's come back, and you have to decide whether it's useful and relevant, and you're going to incorporate it. You're going to incorporate it with some alterations, or actually, and this is actually the most difficult, you're going to ignore it, and you have to say why. Having asked for all this opinion from around the world, you can't just cherry pick what you like. So the process of writing a standard, be it in Britain or internationally, is quite, I wouldn't quite say torturous, but at times it does feel like that.
Yeah.
And you've got to be able to discuss, object, but in the end you've got to reach consensus. So sometimes you have to give up your thoughts on something to get somebody to accept another bit, and really you're trying to aim for a document which globally will be acceptable to most readers.
And that's the main purpose of these standards, for consensus and consistency, and approaches from every single company. So why was ISO 31000 conceived of in the first place? What was the main driver for the need for an international risk standard when there were other standards in place, and how does it all link together?
I think for exactly that reason, that some countries had written their own standards. I mean, Australia was a very early, strong, and a very good standard, an Australian risk standard. And that's fine. But what if you're an international business, or you live in a country and your business is in a country that hasn't got that far? So what international standards try to do is say, well, we're going to take as much as we can from various sources and produce one standard which can be used by anyone and everyone in any country. Most countries will adopt it as it's, so for example, in the UK, the ISO 31000 is technically the BSI ISO 31000, because we've accepted it in its totality and accepted it into the British standards family of standards. And there was, of course, remember, it's just the whole growth 15, 20 years ago, the necessity to promote the concept of good risk management. So ISO saw that, and I suppose for them as well, in the end, it's an income, because you're producing a document that people want to buy as much as anything, as well as, this is a business approach that needs to be promoted for good business. So
great. Yeah, really interesting. That sort of sets the context. Now, if we can try and think about, or if you could give a bit more insight into the content of ISO 31000. So, I'm sure there's a lot of listeners that have read through it, that use it. It's structured, aligned to Annex SL, context, leadership, planning, support, all the sort of key sections that we come to be familiar with, that link to all the other standards like quality or health and safety, and I suppose risk links them all together in a lot of ways, which is I guess for me the key thing that binds all these different types of risk standards together. But from your point of view, what's important about it? What should be the things that we should be looking out for? Maybe the things that might be slightly not obvious to everybody. Maybe the opportunity and threat side. Maybe the different areas. But anything from you writing it and being involved in that you think that we should be looking out for when we're using it in practice?
Always theme number one for me is that it was written in simple English. And actually you have to some extent, because the standards have to be translated into different languages. But if we come back to and that it was to be written in simple English, we weren't to drop into risk jargon, because the point is the standard should be written for everyone, and the vast majority of businesses in this world do not have us professional risk managers working for them. So for me, and I think for the committee, it was important we were writing something that, you're in finance or you're in HR, and somebody's told you, yeah, we want you to do something about this risk stuff, and you sort of go, oh my gosh, where you can pick this up, and it's straightforward and simple, and people haven't had the benefit of risk management training or whatever, or courses or diplomas. They can actually take it and it speaks to them in straightforward language. So we work very hard to get rid of jargon. The other principles were it had to be generic, so it doesn't refer to any, it is a business risk management, organizational risk management standard. It can be used in any organization, be they not-for-profits, local authority or anything. It doesn't matter what the organization is, the standard is generic enough to be taken and used. It's broadly then splits itself into 3 sections. The first is about the principles. Why do we do risk management? What are we trying to achieve by doing risk management? And there's a nice diagram in the principle section, which is at the heart of why we do risk management, is either to protect or enhance value. And by value, we don't necessarily just mean financial value. Whatever it is you're doing as an organisation, your risk management process should protect and enhance that. And so that sits at the heart of the diagram. And then going round in a nice circle is things like, you know, it should be collaborative, nothing should be hidden, it involves human and cultural factors. You know, there's various concepts which we say whatever risk management process and framework you have in place, it should be considering all these things. So to me, actually, that is the most important part of the standard, because, you know, why and what are we supposed to be achieving? It doesn't tell you how you do those things, because that'll vary from organisation to organisation, but it just says this is what you're aiming for. Section 2 is about the framework, so it goes through some of the basics, like, you know, you should have a policy, you should have leadership, you should have training, you know, the nuts and bolts of how the bits in the process of how you deliver a risk management framework in your organisation. Again, we just give suggestions, because a lot of it will be driven by how things are done in your organisation, and they should be done how they're done in your organisation. We talk about integration as well. You shouldn't be delivering a parallel process. You should be integrating risk management into your management processes. The next version we write, we're going to be writing that even more enthusiastically, I think.
And then that's what we'll get to, where it'll evolve. But yeah, that's
yeah.
interesting as well.
Yeah. And then the third section is the basics of a risk management process. You know, how do you identify, assess and score your risks? How do you work out what mitigations you need? You know, the nuts and bolts of how you tend to sort of describe a risk through the process and all that sort of thing. So it is by its nature quite high level. I think it's about 16 pages, something like that. Not very dense. It's certainly not a thesis on anything, but that's the point. It's to give you a high level overview. So I think that's the key things of ISO 31000.
Yeah, it's really useful. And all the other types of standards, let's say it's quality or health and safety, and they're constantly evolving all the time. There's a reference, because any risk approach, whether it's cyber, you know, information security 27001 or whatever, they all have to approach risk, and therefore they can use this standard
yes.
in every single way as well. And I think that's the secret to this as well, or the real use of it. It's like, you know, it is the way of doing risk management, whatever risk you're looking at, and bringing it all together in an enterprise approach.
Yes.
Yeah. Good. So you touched on it's an ever-evolving process, sometimes torturous to be involved in. But where do you see it going in the next few years? What should we be looking out for? Maybe trying to get a step ahead of where it might be evolving to.
Well, 31000 itself is due, I think, quite shockingly, because it doesn't seem that long since we renewed it, but it was in 2018. So, of course, it's coming up to its 5-year cycle. And in fact, as I said, once you're involved in standards, they don't allow you to escape. So I'm currently on a technical group, which is a subcommittee of, you know, there's all sorts of subcommittees and technical groups and working groups, you know, they have a whole language to them. But we've actually been looking at, okay, when we come to rewrite 31000, what is it that needs to be different? And so for the last year or so, that technical committee has been working and sent out a questionnaire around the world, usually through the standards authorities in the countries, to say, can individual managers, risk managers, whatever, tell us what they like or don't like about the current document. I mean, it was rather more structured than that. There were about 20 specific questions. We had a very good response to that, about over 1,000, 1,500 odd individual responses from about 100 and some odd countries. So it, you know, for a survey of that type, it was a reasonably good response. And then we probably spent the last 6 months or so analysing those answers to sort of condense it down into what do they find useful, what do they want more of, you know, that sort of thing. And we've produced that as a report, which has gone back into the main risk management committee in ISO. And there will be soon a a group set up to actually review ISO 31000 and rewrite it, and the work that we've done will feed into that group so that they can see suggestions of improvement. So I think you're probably looking, and this is off the top of my head and probably won't be quite right, you're looking at a new standard. It'll be a couple more years because it takes a while to rewrite, and that's probably me being optimistic, although the committee might be more sort of specific about dates, but these things tend to slightly move. But so in a couple more years or so, there should be an update of 31000.
Okay, great. Any little hints or secrets of what might change, or we don't quite know yet?
Certainly the whole concept of integration. I think, I mean, it's interesting where I work in the House of Commons, my role has just moved away from resilience more towards in with business planning and strategy. I think there is an understanding that we can't just have this sort of standalone risk process with all the sort of software and everything and information flowing through different bits and not integrating with actually how people manage and deliver their business, their department, their objectives. You've got to be very careful that by designing a risk management process, you don't design a parallel system, which is interesting and great, but actually that doesn't help necessarily. It can duplicate and complicate work. So I think there'll be far more about integration and weaving it into your organizational management processes. Emerging risk, looking further into the future than the sort of more immediate risks you've got. Risk appetite concept and usefulness of risk appetite has come up quite a bit.
The organisation is willing to take. Yeah. And I suppose linking to be integrated to integrate an organisation to be even more resilient, adding protecting value you talked about, but being able to absorb and adapt to change as well. These things coming together. Yeah. And
it's having an intelligent conversation that when we talk about risk and risk management, we're not talking about no risk. It's actually how much risk are we willing to take? Yeah. And I think there's got to be this intelligent conversation in a business, that an understanding that risk exists and actually you need it too, but it's having the understanding of how much you're carrying and how much you're willing to carry, and therefore what's appropriate. So I think it's just those all. I mean, I always sort of say the best risk management happens in good management meetings. Doesn't happen in risk reviews and risk things, but how do you build a process which promotes that, and educate, training? A lot of it is about managers and people knowing what you're talking about and them living and breathing it. So I think there'll be more along that line. And you mentioned opportunities. Yes, the fact that risk is not necessarily negative. I mean, there was actually, in the last review, somebody sort of said, we should get rid of this risk word. We shouldn't call it a risk management, because risk has inevitably, most people view it negatively. We should just call it uncertainty management. And actually there's, I thought, I can resonate with that, because it's about uncertainty, and that uncertainty can bring positives. You can take opportunity because you see that, you think, oh, I can go for that. I don't think they'll go that radical next time and just call it an uncertainty management standard, but who knows?
But it is evolving that way, isn't it? And that's what I like about it most, the managing the threats and the opportunities under the umbrella of risk almost. And there's different ways to look at it. I think in the standard it does say risk and opportunities, but to me, I often think of it as threat and opportunities underneath good risk management. So, there's slightly different ways to interpret this all the time, but essentially that's the important part. How can you drive the opportunities to meet your vision, your objectives, and move your organisation forward by taking risks? So it's a great standard. It's obviously very well thought through. A lot of people involved in a lot of countries, like you've explained, and a lot of people using it. So that was amazing to get that sort of insight from you and all your wealth of experience. So really appreciate that, and thank you for your time.
Okay, well, goodbye.
Great.